Hello, everyone. I'm very glad and honored to be part of this 21st International Conference on New Directions in the Humanities. And today, for my presentation, I will be diving into the work of a French author, Édouard Louis, and mainly one of his novels, En Finir avec Eddy Bellegueule, or in English, The End of Eddy. And I'm going to be focusing on the idea of mourning and identity. So, in the introduction of their 1997 book, The Psychic Life of Power, Judith Butler focuses on the creation of identity as a direct consequence of the power or domination exerted into an individual. This generative dimension of power and the new subjugated I created by this dominant-dominated relationship are more complex than they appear, as Butler contends themselves that, and I quote, as a form of power, subjection is paradoxical, end of quote. According to Butler, in this apparent imbalance of power, a hope is born for the emancipatory capacity of the subject. Indeed, more than just creating the identity of the subject, subjection proves to be paradoxical in its effect, an antinomy that Butler summarizes themselves as follows, and I quote, the agency of the subject seems to be an effect of its subordination, end of quote. 17 years after the publication of this work, Édouard Louis provides a concrete example of Butler's theories with his novel En Finir avec Eddy Bellegueule, or in English, The End of Eddy. Published in February 2014 and presented as an autobiographical novel, this work recounts in a somewhat autobiographical form the childhood and adolescence of Eddy Bellegueule, the author's real birth name, in a village of Picardy region in France, and places at its center the process of the construction of identity in an environment where his effeminate gender performance and his sexuality met powerful rejections from his own family and the entire village. Throughout this analysis, the term gender performance or simply performance will be used in the sense given to them by Judith Butler, who defined gender as, and I quote, an identity instituted through the repetition of stylized acts, end of quote. In other words, gender originates in an unconscious game of mimicry performed by an individual to conform to the dominant and deemed acceptable models present in their direct environment. In the novel, humiliation, abuse, violence, alcohol, and misery are the elements that best describe this rural working-class environment, often forgotten by French higher social circles and often by literature. Positioning himself as a privileged witness of this marginalized world and community, Eddy, now Édouard, the author, presents this work as a photograph, a necessary, even if unflattering in some aspects, representation of a certain way of life. Nevertheless, as I read this story, I cannot help but see beyond this simple dimension of testimony. Readers can attest to a real effort from the author to reconnect with his past, to highlight a process of emotional liberation and catharsis through mourning. This mourning, which started by the narrator's self-acceptance at the end of the book, reaches its climax in the difficult and laborious exercise of memory and writing, which allows Édouard, the author, to understand and accept Eddy, the child. Moreover, the author's strength is his ability not only to address his own grief, but to put it into perspective with a more global economy of grief that relates to his family, but also to all the inhabitants of his village. In contrast to what Tolstoy said in Anna Karenina, and I quote, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, end of quote, Édouard Louis presents his family as a typical example of all the unhappy family in his village, thus expanding this process of mourning from a personal to a familial and then to a more globalized level. En Finir avec Eddy Bellegueule is part of the French tradition of the transfuge de classe, or in English, class defectors, narratives, like Annie Ernaux, for example, in her autobiographical novel, La Place. The structure of Édouard Louis' novel reflects this process of rupture, as it is divided in two parts called livre, or book, and respectively entitled Livre 1, Book 1, Picardie, fin des années 90, début des années 2000, so the late 1990s to the early 2000s, and book number 2, or Livre 2, l'échec et la fuite, failure and flight, followed by a small epilogue. From the very first lines, the narrator abruptly introduced his difficult childhood as follows, and I quote, and it is my own translation, and all the translation for the novel will be my own. Of my childhood, I have no happy memories. I don't mean to say that during those years, I never experienced any feeling of happiness or joy. Suffering is simply totalitarian. Anything that doesn't fit into a system, it makes it disappear. End of quote. The narrator thus positions himself as an outsider in his environment, an environment governed by a codified system of powers that cannot ignore particular cases that challenge the status quo. This constant sadness, this permanent storm with occasional sunny spells that constitute the narrator's childhood, provides one of the main reasons for the need of reinvention and escape through a torturous identity journey in which young Eddy struggles to find a place and reconcile his deepest desire, with familial and social expectations. The first scene in the book, described in the story, is one of a violent assault where Eddy is attacked by two other students, a humiliation that is omnipresent and recurrent throughout the novel, a violence that has only one cause, the perception of Eddy's homosexuality through his effeminate behavior or demeanor, which is made clear by straightforward questions such as, and I'm quoting the book, "Are you the faggot?" End of quote. And I'm sorry for the swearing. The reader thus learns that Judith Butler theories about the separation between gender performance and sexuality have not reached this small picker village where quote-unquote feminine masculinity is equated with homosexuality. Unable to escape the judgment of children, Eddy tries to conform to a certain masculine ideal in the family space where the masculinity performed by his father and half-brothers is the blueprint. A masculinity that is based on specific codes such as violence, alcohol, and the absence of emotions other than anger and jealousy. This model constitutes the ultimate goal for Eddy throughout the story, as if reaching it, or at least displaying a convincing performance of this masculinity, will take him out of the dread that governs his life. A dread maternalized physically by the repetitive abuse of the two boys at school, but also linguistically with the overbearing tendency to name the unknown, here homosexuality, by a plethora of synonyms to be able to give an almost palpable, tangible dimension to the hated image. And I will be quoting the book again. The insults followed one another with the blows, and my silence always. And then the author goes on to list a very large variety of words to describe an homosexual in French, and I want to say them in French because I think they will lose their impact in English. So the list goes as follows: pédale, pédé, tentouse, enculé, tarlouse, pédale douce, baltringue, tapette, fiotte, tafiole, tanche, folasse, grosse tante, tata, ou l'homosexuel. End of quote. Hate seems to be a fertile ground for linguistic creation in the novel. Even in the narrator presents these terms as degrading and sometimes as brutal as physical violence itself, he still achieves a certain desensitization and internalization of their violence as a sort of unavoidable consequence of his own behavior. Paradoxically, instead of emancipating himself from these terms, he seeks to modify his own attitude and gender performance so that these words cease to appear in his environment. So we have previously seen that this masculinity, which could be described in the village as heterosexual, and which is Eddy's major inspiration, is notably represented in the family setting. So his father and half-brother are probably the ones who are the most attentive to the performance of masculinity that Eddy should emulate. In their village, they both represent what the Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell calls hegemonic masculinity. That is, a masculinity that refers to the ideal, even if unreachable and attainable, ideal identity to which all men in a social group should aspire to. Representing the highest position in Connell's hierarchy, this hegemonic model status legitimizes its power and superiority through the natural domination of the masculine over the feminine, and consequently through sexism and homophobia. In this hierarchy that places in a position of power a masculinity that is constructed against the idea of the feminine, Eddy, because of his effeminate ways and his homosexuality, finds himself at the lowest rank position and demonstrates what Connell calls a subordinate masculinity. The narrator paints an unflattering portrait of his father and this hegemonic masculinity that seems to reflect the identity of many men in the village. Alcoholic, short-tempered, distant from his own father, a bad student who dropped out of school to work in the local factory that employs mostly men in the village. He is proud to think of himself as a tough guy. This lack of emotions considered feminine, such as sadness or grief, is illustrated when Eddy's father learns of the death of his own father, who abandoned him as a child, and decides to celebrate the news with the rest of the family. This father-son distance is mirrored between Eddy's fathers with his own sons, since even though Eddy's father did not leave the family home, just like his own father, the emotional distance he establishes with Eddy and his brothers is, I think, as detrimental to them as a physical distance. The narrator also highlights the transmission process and the cyclical aspect of this hegemonic masculinity. Indeed, the life trajectory of the elder half-brother seems to follow a similar progression to that of his father. School dropout, alcoholism, and violence even more present than in his father's case, notably with his girlfriend. A behavior that his father judges with severity. This generational gradation of male violence reaches its climax in the story when Eddy's younger brother disappears to raise a carnival, and his older brother, drunk at the time, blames their father for their poor education and decides to hit him. As he refers to Eddy, the drunk brother declares, and I quote, "Look at Eddy and how you raised him, how he is now. He acts like, and excuse my French, a pussy," end of quote. He cannot tolerate Eddy's deviation from the family's masculine tradition, and by extension that of the village, thus highlighting an important element of gender performance in its transmission. Indeed, according to his words, hegemonic masculinity presents itself as something that must be taught sometimes with violence, and the narrator himself concedes the importance of this transmission when he writes, and I quote again the book, "A father reinforced his own masculine identity through his sons, to whom he had to transmit his virile values, and my father would do it. He was going to make me tough. It was his pride as a man that was at stake, end of quote. Through these different episodes, the reader can see a pervasive sense of grief on different levels, taking a path opposite to that of Eddy, who has become Édouard. The narrator, who is recounting his childhood and adolescence, undertakes this work of mourning and identity, and mostly a gender performance, that was his own. His father seems to avoid a similar grieving process, on the other hand. Indeed, so young Eddy, the father categorically forbids himself any form of emotional mourning concerning the death of his own father. But more than this small episode, he seems to avoid the mourning of a life that he did not, but could have lived. A different life where he could have finished his studies, could have gotten a different job, and where he could have aspired to a better social condition. This mourning of a parallel life, the parallel life that could have happened, is a recurrent motif for the characters surrounding Eddy in the story, almost as if they all aspired to a better life, but did not wish to think about it to avoid the suffering of this grieving process. Far more than the men, the women of the village seems to have put an end to their dreams to avoid challenging the patriarchal structures still predominant in the village. The example of Eddy's mother, which the narrator tends to universalize, highlights this idea. He portrays a woman from whom the life of a stay-at-home mother has been imposed, a life that she endures and tries to fill by an excessive use of language and a desire to give meaning and purpose to her repetitive daily actions and chores. She herself evokes this regret, this parallel life that she must now mourn. It is a form of nostalgia with a disrupted temporality where we think not of what has been, but of what could have been, where she declares, and I quote the book, "I could have had a great education, I could have had more diplomas," end of quote. The powerful, almost ghostly grip of these thoughts is clear when she recounts the loss of her first child in crude, detached terms, as if the loss of that child were only a superficial grief in the economy of the generalized grief of her entire life. In this environment, where everyone is reluctant to address their inability to express the mourning of what could have been, it is not surprising that Eddy, always on the fringe of this microcosm, encounters difficulties in constructing his own identity. This is why, although he is aware of his difference, he uses a vocabulary closer to the lexical field of illness to describe his uniqueness, which at the time allows him to shed all responsibility. According to him, his performance of effeminate masculinity is, and I quote, "a problem that has been diagnosed," end of quote, and he is, and I quote again, "dominated, subjugated by these ways," end of quote. Seeing his identity as an external evil that has been imposed upon him, he does not understand the rejection and sometimes violence of his family, who seems to believe that young Eddy is indulging in this transgressive performance. And I quote the book again, "They thought I had made the choice to be effeminate as an aesthetic of myself that I would have pursued to displease them," end of quote. This is why throughout the story, he tries so hard to conform to this hegemonic model that I described earlier by drinking alcohol, by becoming verbally and even physically abusive to women. But Eddy remains aware of the artificiality of this behavior, which is useful not so much to change his deeper identity, but rather to gain acceptance from his male peers. This internalization of this masculinity and the rejection of his own identity give rise to behaviors that even Eddy fails to understand, as when his father, suffering from intense back pain, decides to give Eddy his wedding ring, thinking he might die soon. Rather than seeing this act as the beginning of a possible paternal-son complicity relationship, Eddy finds this behavior disgusting and, more surprisingly, sees as, and I quote the book, "incestuous," end of quote, the "I love you" that his father addresses him. Nevertheless, despite this artificial identity that Eddy tries to create and project, he is acutely aware of his difference. He admits it himself. He liked to cross-dress when he was young and wear his sister's clothes, and he is aware of the progressive realization of his homosexuality. While in the first part of the story, this duality is stable, although difficult to bear, the second part, so the book number 2, shows how Eddy struggles more and more to reconcile these two aspects of his identity. To be more accepted, Eddy befriends other boys in the village, and while these relationships reinforce an acceptable identity, they lead to a growth in his homosexual desire in a group of young men in which homosexuality involves, among other things, the rejection and mockery of homosexuality. This mockery translates into a tendency to undress in the presence of other men and ostensibly show one's genitals. 2 episodes illustrate this idea very well. On the one hand, when the group is drinking on the soccer stadium in the village, and all the boys get drunk and take off their clothes and start running around naked and rubbing each other. And on the other hand, when watching a pornographic film during which the same boys start masturbating together by mutual agreement. Eddy does not indulge in these behaviors because the vision of these naked male bodies awakens in him his forbidden desire. Consequently, he just makes fun of his friends to make them understand that he is definitely not gay. In retrospect, the narrator better understands these behaviors and explains that, and I quote, "playing gay was a way for them to show that they were not," end of quote. Nevertheless, Eddy cannot be part of this group and be accepted without making some concessions and participating in these activities that jeopardize the fragile persona he has constructed for himself. One of these events constitutes the pivotal point of the story. When after watching the pornographic film I mentioned earlier, his friends and cousin introduced the idea of reenacting in real life the action seen in the movie. The narrator presents how they approach the subject, first in a joking tone manner with a vocabulary that oscillates between vernacular, and I'm going to keep the French here because it is hard to translate in English. Ah ouais, ce serait fandard, on se poilerait bien la gueule, end of quote, meaning that it will be very funny. So between this vernacular register and a more standard one, which with expressions like play that game, they were smiling, or everything was a vast joke. All these expressions attached to the lexical field of humor or play allows a detachment from the transgressive character of the idea itself. This process is reinforced by the introduction of an object, a ring, in this scenario, which is supposed to allow a clear hierarchy of the dominated-dominant relationship, which in the logic of the text is equivalent to the man-woman relationship. The narrator describes this scene of homosexual sex in a very raw and crude manner. And I'm going to quote it in English. So beginning of quote, I lay my face down on the floor, or more precisely, my face against the sawdust that formed a thick carpet in the shed and that entered my mouth because of my breathing that sucked it in. My cousin pulled down my pants and handed me one of the rings I had brought back. I felt his warm sex against my buttocks, then inside me. He was giving me instructions. Spread, lift your ass a little. I obeyed all his demands with this impression of realizing and becoming finally what I was. Each stroke he gave made my penis a little harder. And just like when they watched the film for the first time, the laughter of the first strokes quickly gave way to the imitation of the sighs of the pornographic actors, to the lines which appear to me as the most beautiful phrases that I have ever heard. Take my dick, you feel it well. End of quote. For the first time in the story, the narrator describes Eddy in a subordinate position, but not showing any rejection of this violent subordination, almost akin to a sort of consenting loss of agency. Eddy willfully follows order and is fulfilling one of his deepest desires. The prose in the extract that I just read is direct, jerky, a sequence of actions flowing between commas. At the beginning, Eddy seems detached, as if he perceived his physicality as completely detached external to his feelings. Only the end of the description sheds light on Eddy's feelings. He can finally align the two parts of his consciousness, where his social persona meets the expectations of his deeper identity. This key event in Eddy's life marks the irreversible evolution towards his new identity. Despite his eagerness to return to his performance of hegemonic masculinity, notably motivated by his parents who witnessed his transgressive acts, he cannot turn back. This is evidenced by his multiple attempts to reconstruct this persona with two consecutive girlfriends, Laura and Sabrina. But both romantic efforts are futile as Eddy becomes increasingly aware of his homosexuality and the difficulty of reconciling this internal desire with the need to maintain a heterosexual social facade. The narrator eventually detaches himself from this hegemonic masculine model when the young Eddy begins this work of identity mourning. No, he would not be the man his parents expected him to be, nor the man the village demanded of him. This mourning is complex and takes multiple shapes. Indeed, for Eddy or Édouard, mourning his identity consists in mourning several parts of it. One of these elements is manifested in space. At the beginning of the story, space is described in its entirety as the focus of the violence that Eddy experiences. The family home, the school, and the village. All the spaces in which Eddy evolves represent potential sources of danger and aggression. The members of his family at home, the two boys who beat him and insult him during recess at school, and more globally, the whole of the village's inhabitants who shamelessly judge his performance of masculinity. Even a space that for many represents a refuge, a protection against external aggressions, turns into a real cell for Eddy, who describes his bedroom as follows, and I quote, "A room of 5 square meters with a concrete floor and walls covered with large black and circular stains due to humidity," end of quote. This room is a metaphorical representation of Eddy's identity, a small, cramped, dark, gloomy space that limits the range of possibilities for the boy, mirroring the masculinity he aspires to reach. Mirroring his attempts to incorporate a few touches of individuality into this homogeneous gender performance, he also decides to cover up the mold of the walls with posters of female variety singers or TV show heroines cut out of magazines. A parallel that does not escape Eddy's half-brother, who sees in this appropriation of this space, the bedroom, a direct connection to the identity of his brother, whom he mocks by calling the music he listens to as chick music. Sorry. This spatial metaphor reaches its climax towards the end of the story. Because of the humidity, the bunk bed on which Eddy sleeps breaks under his weight. An incident which coincides with Eddy's acceptance of his difference and thus with his willingness to leave behind his tough persona in favor of a more truthful identity. This definitiveness of this rebirth is echoed in the inability to repair the bed. Eddy then understands that this space, the bed, and more largely his village, cannot welcome his rebirth. He then gradually realizes that escape is the only option. The question that arises for Eddy then is how to extricate himself from this environment that leaves no opportunity to fully develop for him. Like Annie Ernaux in Laplace, the story of Édouard Louis, as I mentioned earlier, is one of a transfuge de classe, a class defector. To succeed in this transfer, Édouard had to mourn a certain culture, a certain language. The narrator mentions this mourning of culture many times when considering his family's habits, such as watching television, for example. Television as the only cultural resource allowed in the home, an almost religious object for parents who cannot do without its presence during meals or in the morning when they wake up. However, the most blatant example of the radical break with this culture is undoubtedly related to language. Indeed, the narrator alludes in the story to 2 languages that he introduces as quite different, notably by a strong binary between their language and my language or his language. This dichotomy is also found in the typography of the story itself, in the book, in the materiality of the book, in which the narrator's words are quote-unquote normal, while the words produced by his parents, his friends, and the inhabitants of the village are all in italics. 2 impermeable language registers, a vernacular French and a more canonical French that never mix. It is even more interesting that it will be through theater that Eddy will be able to emancipate himself, a discipline governed by the use of a high language register that his family would have never been able to understand in the first place. An abandonment of language, a certain language that goes hand in hand with an intellectual and cultural emancipation, leaving behind a milieu where, and I quote the book, to speak philosophy was to speak like the enemy class, those who have the means, the rich, end of quote. School is a real way out for young Eddy, who sees no future in this environment that is increasingly foreign to him. During an audition that constitutes the first step towards his new life, Eddy is still confronted to his difference because of his surname that makes children and adults alike smile. He is both on the margins in his home village because of his performance of effeminate masculinity and his budding homosexuality, and on the margins in a higher social milieu because of his surname, his clothes, and the stigma that relentlessly brings him back to his lower economic and social condition. He must reconstruct an identity to leave the margins and move closer to a center, wherever it may be. His departure does not appear as a heartbreak or an abandonment of any sort, but rather a rebirth. Upon receiving his acceptance letter for Amiens High School, Eddy is relieved. As he says himself in the book, I was already far away. I did not belong to their world anymore. The letter said so. End of quote. The epilogue introduces the first steps of the new Eddy, not quite Édouard yet, who, after arriving in Amiens, realizes the narrow-mindedness of the people in this village. This transition from the village to Amiens shows how he manages to extricate himself from this position of exclusion from the masculine to access a sexually viable position in the bourgeois world. A transition made possible by his radical decision of separation, his abandonment of codes, traditions, and beliefs, and by a subjective disengagement from his previous position that allows him to emancipate himself from the restrictions imposed by his family and his village. In Amiens, the masculinity and the behaviors that were previously forbidden to him are accepted. There, and I quote the text, boys kissed each other to say hello, they don't shake hands, the bourgeois don't have the same uses of their bodies, they don't define manhood like my father, like the men in the factory. End of quote. Eddy then understands that the identity he had to hide all of these years was not a problem in itself, but a class problem. A problem that the class defector, Eddy, is now able to understand as external to himself, to his physicality. This rebirth of identity thus happens via a geographical and social relocation and by a necessary mourning process that incorporate idea of spatiality, culture, linguistics, and family emancipation. To return to Judith Butler and their thoughts on subjection, submission is a process of identity creation of the subdued subject, and paradoxically, it also attributes a certain power to the latter. I quote Judith Butler, the double aspect of subjection appears to lead to a vicious circle. The agency of the subject appears to be an effect of its subordination. End of quote. In Eddy's case, this vicious circle is nevertheless broken because he decides not to use his agency to stand up against the system of oppression that paradoxically endowed him with said power, but to get out of this domination and use his power to construct or reconstruct an identity for himself outside of this system. The people of his village, on the other hand, although aware of their grief and mourning, cannot escape these powers by remaining geographically and mentally and emotionally within the village. All in all, in this semi-autobiographical novel, which illustrates the process of mourning a past identity, Édouard Louis puts his memories on paper in a work of catharsis that seems necessary. However, the final stage of this identity reconstruction does not appear in the book. By changing his name later on from Eddy Bellegueule in the book to Édouard Louis in the present time, the writer breaks with his past and with this name, which, according to the quote of Marguerite Duras, used as an epigraph, is, and I quote, a pronounced name which does not name anything. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and please feel free to leave any questions in the comments. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.